It's not that often that you see a progressive rock band spin off into successful pop music, but one band that was able to do just that and more was Genesis. If you're only familiar with Genesis's radio hits, stuff like Land of Confusion, Misunderstanding, and Invisible Touch, you might not even know that at one time they were on the bleeding edge of progressive music. They made sound in innovative and sometimes downright strange ways. Not only was Genesis massively successful on the pop charts in their later years, but the band was a springboard for the equally successful careers of both Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins. I still can't stop into a Goodwill, or even a gas station for that matter, without hearing at least one song from one of these musicians. Genesis started like most bands in the late 60s, playing a bluesy form of rock, but by their second album they were an all-out progressive music giant. So what was it that made the music of Genesis's early years so progressive, and what caused the shift towards a more pop-oriented sound in their later years? Well, today we're going to take a look at the progressive music of Genesis.
Jacob, wake up, you got to tidy your room now. Then Mr. Lewis, isn't it time that he was out on his own?
Genesis's foray into progressive rock began with their second album, Trespass. Trespass set Genesis into progressive motion, with more interesting melodies and Gabriel's bizarre and unique vocal style, which would include various effects that were typically reserved for instruments and various vocal styles which implied conversations between multiple characters. The 9-minute-long single, The Knife, was unique at that time for its length, distinctive style, and the incorporation of atypical instruments like flute and those effective vocal tracks we just mentioned. Genesis developed more rhythmic freedom when Phil Collins joined the band the next year for 1971's Nursery Crime. The album was also first to feature Steve Hackett as guitarist. Hackett at the time was looking for a band that would share his desire to drive beyond existing stagnant music forms. And so with Nursery Crime, that's exactly what they set out to do. Nursery Crime would go on to be Genesis's first critical and commercial success and push the boundaries of rock music further than any of their previous material by a mile. The lyrics of Peter Gabriel flourished into fairy story epics, maturely incorporating serious themes like violence and sex, while also maintaining a unique and dark humor. On stage, Gabriel incorporated theatrical elements into his performance, donning costumes that aided in telling the elaborate stories of the album like a stage production. Two costumes of this era were particularly popular. One was a red fox mask worn over Gabriel's wife's dress, and the other was the face of an old man. The costumes and elaborate stage performance added to the allure of Genesis and their shows and helped them to gather a cult following of devoted fans. Also somewhat atypical of rock music in the 70s, vocal duty was divided among members of the band at times, with Collins taking the reins on songs like For Absent Friends. The lyrical concepts ranged from Greek myth to more modern fairy tales and were accented by the manic musicianship of the band, a mix of highly orchestrated rhythmic progressions, interesting instrumentation, including organ, mellotron, and flute, and hard-rocking jams that added a distinctive flavor of improvisation to each performance. These are the musical trends that Genesis would continue to build on with their following albums. As the band started to garner more commercial success, they expanded their stage show to include more lighting effects and props, and Gabriel developed new characters, such as Magog, the Watcher of the Skies, who would appear in 1972's successful Foxtrot.
Watcher of the skies, watcher of all. He's the world alone, no world is own.
Foxtrot continued to experiment with time signatures in general, with pieces flip-flopping in rhythm amidst dissonant chord structures that were very unlike most music at the time. The album concludes with a 23-minute-long suite, Supper's Ready. Supper's Ready contains multiple sections touching on themes of apocalypse and supernatural imagery, and the incorporation of non-standard time signatures, with sections in 9/8 and abounding in polymetric instrumental solos. Their next album, Selling England by the Pound, remains a fan favorite from the era, and it mostly continued the pace set by other records, with songs like Cinema Show, The Battle of Epping Forest, and Firth of Fifth, which are often cited as huge influences on other progressive artists, people like Rush, Pain of Salvation, and even Yngwie Malmsteen. Musicians tend to talk about Selling England by the Pound favorably, like Fish from Marillion calling the album the definitive Genesis album, and even John Lennon expressed admiration for it. But 1974 brought what might be Genesis' most adventurous album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
And the lamb lies down on Broadway.
Gabriel's dramatic flair reached its zenith with the concept double album, telling a single continuous story which was punctuated with strange and bizarre creatures and characters, and surreal imagery fit for a Lewis Carroll story. Moving on from their previously British imagery, Gabriel decided to make the album's concept have a more American flavor, with appearances of bizarre happenings in New York City and commentary on American business practices. The surreal imagery was inspired by Jungian psychoanalysis and the works of directors like Alejandro Jodorowsky, which gave the album a film-like flow and a sense of symbolism. The stage show continued to explode with theatrical elements, with Gabriel disappearing in a puff of smoke and donning sometimes cumbersome outfits for the sake of the appearance of a Broadway theater show. The music was largely choreographed and full of intricate passages which did just as much to tell the story as the lyrics and costumes. But the huge persona of Gabriel began to cast a shadow over the group, with him becoming increasingly the center of attention at concerts. After all, how could you keep your eyes off of him? Between this and the personal issues within the band, the seeds of Peter Gabriel's departure were sown, and in 1975 he left, going on to begin a successful solo career. But with Gabriel's departure, the band was free to explore musical ideas in a different way, and some might say that their days as a progressive rock band were numbered. Genesis in their early years were unambiguously one of the most progressive bands around. But as they experienced shifts in members and the musical landscape around them changed, the question of whether or not they stayed a progressive rock band becomes a little harder to answer. So check back in soon, because next time we're going to take a look into Genesis's later years and ask, is it prog? If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And let me know in the comments if you think that Genesis's prog years ended with Peter Gabriel leaving, or if their progressive spirit carried on into their later years.